I didn't say a word when the lawyer cleared his throat and said, based on Clause 17, Mr. Cole now holds controlling rights over all protected assets, because by that point, silence had already done all the work for me. Vanessa's chair scraped sharply against the marble floor as she stood up too fast, her glass tipping, champagne spilling across the table like something fragile finally breaking, and Derek, who had spent years laughing the loudest, didn't laugh this time. He just stared at the document like it had betrayed him personally, like paper wasn't supposed to have consequences, like words weren't supposed to remember everything they had done to me. What none of them understood in that moment, what none of them had ever understood, was that nothing about that prenup had been accidental, not the wording, not the timing, not even the way I signed it without hesitation while they watched me like I was volunteering to be owned. They thought that night had been about putting me in my place. They thought the joke was finally complete. And for a long time, I let them believe that. I let Vanessa introduce me at dinners with that polished smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes, the one that always came with a small pause before she said my name like it needed justification. I let Derek make his comments, casual enough to pass as humor, sharp enough to leave a mark, the kind of remarks that drew polite laughter from people who didn't want to be on the wrong side of the table. "Ethan's lucky," he used to say, swirling his drink like he was evaluating something cheap. "Not everyone gets a front row seat to a life they couldn't afford on their own." And I would just nod, not because I agreed, but because correcting him would have ruined the illusion they all needed to maintain. They needed me to be small. They needed me to be temporary. They needed the story to make sense. Vanessa came from money, old money, the kind that didn't talk about itself because it didn't have to, the kind that filled rooms before she even walked into them, and I knew exactly how I looked standing next to her, in their world, in their conversations, in their assumptions. I wasn't loud, I didn't compete, I didn't explain, and that was enough for them to decide everything else. What they didn't know was that I had been paying attention the entire time, not to the insults themselves, but to the pattern behind them, to the way disrespect wasn't random in that family, it was structured, repeated, almost ritualistic, like it had rules of its own. And that's the thing about rules, especially the ones people think are invisible, they can be written down, formalized, turned into something enforceable. That prenup wasn't just a contract. It was a mirror. It reflected exactly who they were, clause by clause, condition by condition, long before any of them realized they were being measured. When Vanessa slid those papers across the table years ago, surrounded by her friends, her family, her carefully curated audience, she thought she was setting boundaries. She thought she was protecting what was hers. What she didn't understand was that protection goes both ways, and once something is written, it doesn't forget, it doesn't forgive, and it doesn't care who thought they were in control when they signed it. So when the lawyer finished reading and the room went quiet in a way I had never heard before, it wasn't shock that filled the space. It was recognition. Not from them. From me. Because for the first time, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I met Vanessa in a place where everything looked expensive but nothing felt real, a charity gala her family sponsored every year in downtown Chicago, the kind of event where people talked about impact while checking who else was watching, and I remember thinking she did not belong there in the same way the others did, not because she lacked confidence but because she carried it differently, quieter, more controlled, like she had never needed to prove anything to anyone in the room. She approached me first, which surprised me, asked what I did, listened without interrupting, and for a moment it felt normal, like two people having a conversation without an audience. At that time, I was working in financial compliance, a field most people found boring until they realized how much money it protected, and I kept my explanations simple because I had learned early on that the more you explained, the more people tried to measure you against something they already believed. Vanessa smiled like she understood more than she said, and that was enough for me to stay in that conversation longer than I usually would. What I did not realize then was that she was used to observing people the same way her family did, not just who they were but what they represented, where they fit, how they could be positioned. The difference was she made it feel personal. Our relationship moved quickly after that, not in a chaotic way, but in a structured, almost efficient progression, dinners that turned into weekends, weekends that turned into shared routines, and before long, I was being introduced to her world, not all at once, but in carefully managed pieces. The first time I met Derek was at a private dinner at their family home, a place that felt less like a house and more like a statement, every room designed to remind you that you were inside something built long before you arrived. He shook my hand with a smile that did not reach his eyes and asked me what I did again, even though Vanessa had already told him, and when I answered, he nodded slowly like he was filing the information away somewhere specific. That was the first moment I noticed the pattern, not in what he said, but in what he chose not to say, the slight pause before responding, the glance toward Vanessa, the subtle shift in tone that turned a simple question into an evaluation. Over time, those small moments became more frequent, comments that sounded like jokes but carried weight, questions that were not really questions, and Vanessa never corrected him, not directly, not even privately. She would just move the conversation forward like nothing had happened, like it was easier to ignore than to challenge. I told myself it did not matter, that people like Derek needed that kind of control to feel secure, that Vanessa and I were separate from that dynamic, and for a while, I believed that. But belief has a way of adjusting itself when the same pattern repeats often enough, when silence starts to feel less like patience and more like permission, and that was when I started paying closer attention, not just to what they said, but to how often they said it, how consistently the same assumptions appeared, how predictable their reactions became. They thought they understood me because I did not correct them. They thought my silence confirmed their version of the story. What they did not consider was that silence can also be a decision, and decisions, when made early enough, can shape everything that comes after. It did not happen all at once, that would have been easier to dismiss, easier to confront, but instead it built slowly, almost carefully, like they were testing how far they could go without resistance, and every time I chose not to react, they took it as confirmation that there would be no consequence. It started with small things, the kind people brush off in public, a comment about my watch being refreshingly simple, compared to the ones Derek collected, or the way Vanessa would correct me in front of others with a tone that sounded helpful but felt rehearsed, like she needed to remind the room where the difference between us existed. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that people from different backgrounds had different ways of communicating, that it would settle over time as they got used to me, but that assumption only made it easier for them to continue. Derek, especially, seemed to treat every interaction like a performance, always waiting for the right moment to insert a line that would get a reaction, not from me, but from the people around us, because he never cared how I responded, only how the room responded. "You have got to admire the efficiency," he said once during a dinner with her parents, leaning back in his chair like he had just made a clever observation. Ethan skipped the whole process and went straight to the result, and a few people laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, but enough to let him know he had landed it, enough to reinforce the pattern. I remember Vanessa smiling at that moment, not in agreement, but not in disagreement either, just enough to let it pass, just enough to keep things comfortable for everyone except me. That was the part that stayed with me, not the words themselves, but the consistency, the way it became expected, the way every gathering included some variation of the same idea, that I was fortunate to be there, that my presence required explanation, that my role was temporary unless proven otherwise. Over time, it moved beyond private dinners into public spaces, charity events, business functions, even casual weekends with their friends, and the tone shifted from subtle to direct. Derek started introducing me himself, not as Vanessa's partner, but as the guy who beat the system, always with a grin, always followed by a story that implied I had somehow bypassed the effort required to belong in their world. People would nod, some would laugh, others would look at me with polite curiosity, and I would respond the same way every time, calm, measured, without correction, because by then I understood something they did not, that repetition creates evidence, and evidence, when documented properly, becomes something entirely different. Vanessa never stopped it, not once, not even when it crossed into something more personal, comments about my family, my upbringing, the choices I made before I met her, all framed as observations, never accusations, but always delivered in a way that left no room for interpretation. I noticed the way she would glance at Derek before responding, the way their timing aligned, the way one would set up a moment and the other would complete it, like they had done it so many times it no longer required effort. They thought it was harmless, just part of how they interacted, just part of their world, and maybe for them it was. But for me, it was data, each comment, each reaction, each witness, each environment, all fitting into a structure they could not see forming around them. What they did not understand was that disrespect, when consistent enough, stops being subjective and starts becoming measurable, and once something can be measured, it can be defined, and once it is defined, it can be enforced, and that was the part they never considered, not once, not even on the nights when they laughed the hardest, because they believed the story they had created, and as long as I stayed silent, they believed I was part of it. The shift from private remarks to public displays did not feel sudden, it felt intentional, like they had slowly tested every boundary and found none, and once that happened, the tone changed in a way that could not be ignored anymore, not by me, and not by anyone paying close enough attention. It was no longer just dinners or small gatherings, it became something they carried into every room, every event, every introduction, and what made it worse was how natural they made it look, how effortless it seemed, like this was simply how things worked, like I had already agreed to play that role without realizing it. One night stood out more than the others, not because it was louder, but because it was cleaner, sharper, more deliberate. It was at a corporate fundraiser Vanessa's family hosted every fall, the kind of event where people in tailored suits spoke in quiet tones about investments and partnerships while measuring each other in ways that never needed to be said out loud. The room was filled with people who understood value, or at least believed they did, and Derek knew exactly how to use that. He raised his glass during a casual circle of conversation and said, "You know, I have always respected efficiency, and I already knew what was coming before he even looked at me, before the pause, before the slight shift in posture that signaled the moment was his." Ethan figured out how to skip years of building something and just marry into it, he added, smiling like he had just offered a compliment, and the group responded exactly the way he expected, a mix of polite laughter and knowing looks, the kind that do not challenge the statement but quietly accept it as truth. I did not respond, not because I did not have anything to say, but because I understood the structure of what was happening, that reacting would only confirm the role they had already assigned to me, and Derek thrived on that reaction, on the validation of control. Vanessa stood beside me, composed as always, her expression neutral, her silence consistent, and that consistency was louder than anything Derek said. Because it told everyone in that circle that his version of me was acceptable, that it did not need correction. Over time, moments like that became expected, almost scheduled in their predictability, and the environments expanded, business dinners, weekend gatherings at their lake house, even casual brunches where the setting was relaxed but the pattern remained the same. Derek would find his moment, Vanessa would allow it, and the room would follow. What changed was not just the frequency, but the precision, the way the comments started to target specific things, my career, my background, the way I spoke, even the way I chose to remain quiet, all framed as observations but delivered with intent. "You ever notice," Derek said once during a dinner overlooking the water, "how some people are just naturally comfortable letting others lead," and he did not need to say my name for everyone to understand the reference, because by then, the story had already been built, reinforced, repeated enough times that it existed independently of anything I said or did. What they did not realize was that while they were building that story, I was building something else entirely, something quieter, something structured, something that did not rely on perception but on documentation, because every public setting added weight, every witness added credibility, every repeated behavior added clarity, and clarity is what transforms opinion into fact. They believed they were creating a narrative about me, but in reality, they were creating a record about themselves, one that was far more detailed than they ever intended, one that captured not just what they said, but how often they said it, where they said it, and who was there to hear it. And the more confident they became, the more consistent they became, the easier it was for me to see the pattern in full, not as isolated moments, but as a system they had built without realizing it, a system that would eventually have to answer for itself, whether they were prepared for that or not. The night of the engagement dinner was the first time they stopped pretending it was subtle, the first time everything they had been building quietly became something staged, something deliberate, something designed to be seen and remembered. Vanessa had chosen the venue carefully, a private penthouse overlooking the city, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting soft gold light across polished marble and glass, the kind of place where every detail was curated to signal status without needing explanation. Guests moved through the space in controlled conversations, laughter measured, voices low, the atmosphere balanced between celebration and evaluation, and I understood immediately that this was not just a dinner, it was a performance, and everyone there had a role except me, or at least that was what they believed. My place card sat at the far end of the table, positioned just enough off-center to feel intentional, and when I took my seat, I noticed the envelope waiting on my plate before anyone said a word, thick, cream-colored, placed with the same precision as everything else in the room. I did not open it right away, not because I did not know what it was, but because I wanted to see how they would present it, how they would turn something private into something public. Vanessa stood once everyone was seated, lifting her glass with that same composed smile she had perfected over the years, the kind that made people lean in without realizing it. She spoke about partnership, about protecting what generations had built, about responsibility, each word chosen carefully, each sentence structured to sound reasonable while setting the stage for what came next. Then she looked directly at me, not with warmth, not with hesitation, but with expectation. "I think," she said, her voice even, controlled, "that when two people come from different places, it is only fair to define things clearly from the beginning." There was a pause, just long enough for the room to understand what she meant before she said it. Derek leaned back in his chair, already smiling, already anticipating the moment. "Transparency is important," he added, his tone casual, but his timing exact, and a few people nodded, a few glanced toward me, waiting. That was when I opened the envelope, slowly, deliberately, not giving them the reaction they expected, not giving them anything they could use. The document inside was exactly what I had anticipated, detailed, structured, written to protect assets, define boundaries, establish control, and as I turned the pages, I could feel the room watching, measuring, waiting for hesitation, for resistance, for something that would confirm the story they had already decided was true. Vanessa remained standing, her posture perfect, her expression steady, and Derek did not look at the document at all, he watched me instead, like the paper did not matter, like the outcome had already been decided. "It is standard," Vanessa said, as if she was offering reassurance, but the way she held the room made it clear this was not about comfort, it was about position, about making sure everyone present understood exactly where I stood in relation to her world. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, just long enough for anticipation to build, and then I picked up the pen. No questions. No negotiation. No hesitation. I signed every page exactly where indicated, my hand steady, my expression unchanged, and when I slid the document back across the table, Derek laughed softly, shaking his head like he had just witnessed something inevitable. Vanessa smiled, satisfied, controlled, as if the moment had confirmed everything she believed. What none of them understood, what none of them even considered asking, was why it had been so easy, why I had not argued, why I had not defended myself, why I had not tried to change a single word, because in their version of the story, there was no reason for me to know anything beyond what was in front of me. But the truth was, I had already seen that document long before that night, long before the room, long before the performance, and the version they thought they were presenting to me was not the version that would matter when it was finally read the way it was meant to be. By the time that document reached the table that night, it had already passed through hands that understood exactly how words could be used not just to protect wealth, but to define behavior, to set conditions, to establish consequences that did not need to be enforced immediately to be effective. What Vanessa believed was a standard agreement had started as one, drafted by her family's legal team with the same precision they applied to everything else, but what she did not realize was that standard language only remains standard until someone who understands it decides to read it differently. Months before that dinner, long before the invitations were sent out, I had been invited into a conversation that she was not part of, a quiet meeting in an office that did not need to impress anyone because its purpose was not appearance, it was structure. Her family's attorney had presented the initial draft to me as a formality, something to review, something to acknowledge, something they assumed I would accept without question, because in their version of events, I did not have the leverage to negotiate. I did not challenge that assumption. Instead, I asked questions, not many, just enough to clarify intent, just enough to understand how each clause functioned, how each condition was triggered, how each definition could be interpreted under different circumstances. The attorney answered carefully, professionally, explaining the protections, the limitations, the boundaries that ensured Vanessa's interests remained secure regardless of outcome. What he did not expect was that I was not evaluating the document as a participant, I was evaluating it as a system, identifying where behavior intersected with consequence, where patterns could be defined, where repetition could transform into breach. When I suggested revisions, they were subtle, framed as clarifications rather than changes, language that refined definitions rather than expanded them, but each adjustment served a specific purpose, each word placed deliberately to ensure that what appeared neutral on the surface carried weight beneath it. The clause that mattered most was not obvious, not highlighted, not positioned as a centerpiece, it was embedded within the behavioral section, a provision that addressed sustained patterns of public disparagement, reputational harm, and intentional misrepresentation within shared social and professional environments. On its own, it looked like protection, a safeguard against external threats, but its application was not limited to outsiders, and that distinction was the part no one focused on. The attorney reviewed the revisions, asked a few questions, then incorporated them into the final draft without resistance, because from his perspective, they did not alter the balance of power, they simply reinforced the structure already in place. Vanessa never saw those discussions, never asked about the details, never considered that the document she would later present as a form of control had already been shaped in ways she did not understand. To her, it was a tool to define boundaries. To me, it was a framework to measure behavior over time. After that meeting, I did not bring it up again. I did not hint at it, did not reference it, did not give any indication that anything had changed, because the effectiveness of something like that depends entirely on expectation, on the belief that nothing beyond the obvious exists. And expectation, once established, is rarely questioned. So I continued exactly as they expected, attending events, listening to comments, allowing the pattern to develop without interruption, because interruption would have altered the trajectory, would have reduced the consistency, would have made the behavior less predictable. Instead, I let it continue, let each moment add to the record, let each public setting reinforce the pattern, because the clause did not respond to isolated incidents, it responded to sustained conduct, to repetition that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding. Vanessa and Derek believed they were defining me through those moments, shaping how others perceived me, reinforcing a narrative that benefited them, but what they did not realize was that every time they did it, they were contributing to something far more structured, something that did not rely on opinion or interpretation, something that would eventually be read not as a story, but as a condition that had already been met. And by the time they would understand that, the document they thought protected them would be the same document that defined exactly how much they had to lose. The pattern held because they believed it was harmless, and it continued because no one ever challenged it, but patterns like that have a way of accelerating when they go unchecked, especially when the people creating them feel comfortable enough to stop pretending. It was a quarterly investment dinner that finally pushed everything into alignment, not because it was louder than the others, but because it crossed from personal into professional in a way that could no longer be dismissed as casual behavior. The event was held in a private dining room at a high-end restaurant overlooking the river, the kind of place where deals were discussed between courses and reputations were reinforced with quiet confidence. Vanessa had invited several of her family's long-standing business contacts, people who understood contracts, leverage, and risk, people who did not laugh easily unless something served a purpose. That was what made Derek's timing so precise that night, because he knew exactly who was in the room and what kind of impression he wanted to leave. As conversations shifted toward long-term planning and asset protection, he leaned forward, resting his glass on the table, and said, "Speaking of risk management, I always tell Vanessa she made the smartest investment of all," and he paused just long enough for the room to turn toward him before continuing, "She secured the upside without taking on any real liability," and then he looked directly at me, not waiting for a reaction, not needing one, because the implication was already clear. A few people smiled politely, others exchanged glances, and Vanessa let out a soft laugh like it was a harmless observation, like it did not require correction, like it fit neatly into the narrative they had been building for years. I noticed the shift immediately, not in the words, but in the audience, because this was not a room that ignored details, this was a room that catalogued them, and for the first time, the pattern was being observed by people who understood what repeated behavior implied when it was tied to formal agreements. That was the moment the clause moved from theoretical to active, not because of a single comment, but because of the accumulation that comment represented, the consistency, the public nature, the presence of witnesses who could not dismiss it as private humor. I did not respond. I did not interrupt. I let the conversation move forward exactly as they expected, because the effectiveness of what had been set in motion depended on that continuation, on the absence of resistance that would have broken the pattern. But something had changed, not for them, but for me, because I could see the threshold had been crossed. The conditions that had been defined months earlier were no longer potential, they were met, documented, reinforced in a setting that carried weight beyond social interaction. Vanessa continued the evening as if nothing had happened, guiding conversations, maintaining control of the room, and Derek moved on to other topics, confident as always, unaware that the moment he thought strengthened his position had done the opposite. What they did not realize was that the agreement they relied on did not require immediate confrontation, it required confirmation, and confirmation had just been established in a way that could not be undone. From that point forward, everything else became procedural, not emotional, not reactive, but structured, timed, and inevitable. They believed they were still defining the narrative, still shaping perception, still operating within a system that favored them, but what they did not know was that the system had already shifted, and by the time it revealed itself, there would be no room left for interpretation, only the outcome they had unknowingly built for themselves. The meeting where everything shifted did not look dramatic from the outside, it looked routine, scheduled, procedural, exactly the kind of environment Vanessa trusted because it followed rules she believed she understood. It was held in a quiet conference room on the 32nd floor of her family's legal firm, a space designed for clarity rather than display, glass walls, a long table, and documents placed neatly in front of each seat before anyone arrived. Vanessa walked in first, composed as always, her posture straight, her expression controlled, already assuming this was another formality, another step in maintaining the structure she believed protected her. Derek followed, slightly less patient, scanning the room as if he expected to be entertained, his confidence intact, his assumptions unchanged. I arrived last, not late, just last, and took my seat without speaking, because by that point, everything that needed to be said had already been written. The attorney entered with a folder that looked identical to the one Vanessa had presented months earlier, same color, same thickness, same careful arrangement, and that familiarity was intentional, it kept everyone comfortable, it reinforced the idea that nothing had changed. He began calmly, reviewing standard sections, definitions, timelines, responsibilities, all the language Vanessa had expected to hear, all the structures she believed were still working in her favor, and for a few minutes, everything remained exactly as she anticipated. Then he paused. Not dramatically, not for effect, just long enough to shift the room from passive listening to attention. He turned a page and said, "We will now address the enforcement provisions outlined in Clause 17, and that was the moment the air changed, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said, precise, measured, final." Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her expression tightening for the first time, while Derek remained relaxed, still assuming this was procedural, still believing nothing in that document could work against them. The attorney continued, explaining that the clause had been triggered based on documented, repeated patterns of public disparagement and reputational harm within shared social and professional environments, language that sounded technical but carried weight, language that did not rely on opinion but on evidence, on consistency, on repetition observed over time. Vanessa's eyes moved across the document faster now, searching for something she had missed, something she did not remember agreeing to, while Derek's confidence began to shift into confusion, the kind that comes when certainty starts to lose its foundation. As defined within the agreement, the attorney said, such conduct constitutes a breach that activates the reallocation of controlling rights over protected assets, and then he looked directly at me, not for permission, not for confirmation, but as acknowledgement of what had already been established. That was when Vanessa spoke, her voice controlled but sharper than before, asking how this interpretation was possible, how something like that could apply under these circumstances, and the attorney responded the same way he had throughout the entire process, calmly, precisely, referring back to the language, to the definitions, to the revisions that had been incorporated into the final draft. Derek tried to interject, to reframe it as misunderstanding, as exaggeration, as something that could be dismissed, but the structure did not allow for that, because the clause did not depend on a single moment, it depended on a pattern, and that pattern had already been confirmed in environments that carried weight beyond personal interaction. The room did not erupt, there was no shouting, no chaos, just a quiet realization settling in, the kind that replaces confidence with calculation, the kind that forces people to reconsider everything they assumed was fixed. Vanessa looked at me then, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with something closer to recognition, like she was finally seeing the part of the equation she had ignored, and I met her gaze without expression, because there was nothing left to explain. The document had already done that. The terms had already been set. And the outcome they were now facing was not something I had imposed, it was something they had built themselves, one moment at a time, without ever realizing where it would lead. The silence that followed was not empty, it was precise, controlled, the kind of silence that replaces noise when everything that needed to be argued has already been decided by something stronger than opinion. Vanessa did not raise her voice again, she did not repeat her question, she simply sat back slowly, her eyes still on the document as if reading it again might change what it said, as if clarity could somehow be undone by disbelief. Derek leaned forward, his earlier confidence now replaced with calculation, scanning the pages like he was searching for an exit that did not exist, flipping through sections he had never bothered to understand before, his movements sharper, less controlled, the performance gone because there was no audience left to impress. The attorney remained exactly the same, composed, neutral, continuing to outline the procedural next steps as if this were no different from any other enforcement review, because to him, it was not personal, it was structure, and structure does not react, it executes. I did not interrupt him, did not add to what he said, because there was nothing left for me to contribute, the document had already spoken in full, and anything I said at that point would have only reduced the clarity of what had been established. Vanessa finally looked up, not at the attorney, but at me, and for the first time since I had known her, there was no control in her expression, no polished composure, just recognition, not of what had happened, but of what had always been there and ignored. "You knew," she said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a realization, and I met her gaze the same way I had in every moment before, calm, measured, without reaction. I did not confirm it. I did not deny it. I simply let the silence answer for me, because by then, she already understood. Derek tried one last time to reframe it, to suggest that things could be renegotiated, that interpretations could be revisited, that this did not have to be final, but the attorney's response was the same as before, precise, grounded in the language, in the definitions, in the conditions that had already been met, and there was no room left for negotiation because the agreement had never been about negotiation once it reached this point. It had always been about enforcement. When the meeting concluded, there was no dramatic ending, no confrontation, no raised voices, just chairs moving back, documents being gathered, people standing up with the quiet understanding that something irreversible had taken place. Vanessa did not try to stop me when I stood, did not reach for an explanation, did not ask for anything more, because she knew that anything she could say would come too late to matter. Derek avoided looking at me entirely, his focus fixed on the table, on the pages, on anything that did not require acknowledgement of what had just happened. I walked out the same way I had walked into every room before, without urgency, without hesitation, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to correct, nothing left to defend. The difference was that this time, I was not leaving behind assumptions or expectations, I was leaving behind a structure that no longer included me as something to be defined by others. Outside, the city looked exactly the same, traffic moving, people passing, everything continuing as if nothing had changed, and in a way, nothing had, because the shift had never been about the world around me, it had always been about the position I allowed myself to hold within it. They had spent years believing silence meant weakness, believing patience meant absence of power, believing that if something was not visible, it did not exist, and that belief had shaped every decision they made, every word they said, every moment they created. What they did not understand, not until it was too late, was that silence can be intentional, patience can be strategic, and the things people choose not to show are often the things that matter most when everything else falls away. I did not need to say anything as I stepped into the elevator, did not need to look back, because the outcome had never depended on how I reacted in that final moment. It depended on everything that came before it, everything they had done, everything they had repeated, everything they had turned into a pattern without realizing it was being measured. And by the time they finally saw it clearly, there was nothing left for them to change, only something left for them to understand, and in the end, the real mistake was underestimating silence. Thank you for being here with us. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.